Hi everybody, welcome back, glad you could tune in again. Okay, let's take a look at the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 1 verse 1, helpful place to start because it picks up from the previous book, the book of Genesis. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt. This is, of course, a reminder of where we've picked up from before, that there are 70 people altogether in the community of people who ended up in Egypt at the end of the narrative of the book of Genesis. This also reminds us of the promise back in Genesis chapter 12, which, if you recall, I mentioned structures certainly the first 5, 6, 7 books of the Bible, and arguably the whole of the Bible. God's promise to Abraham of land, people, and blessing, which somehow will be for all the nations. Now, remember I mentioned that Genesis is the beginning of the promise beginning of the fulfillment of the promise of many people. It's Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, and finally a growing community, the 12 sons who get reunited at the end. Well, Exodus picks that up and very quickly explains how that promise is brought to complete fulfillment. There are the people multiplied exceedingly, grew exceedingly strong, so the land was filled with them. So pretty much at the beginning of the book of Exodus, you can tick that promise off. The people promise is pretty much fulfilled. But that then provokes the problem that the book of Exodus is all about dealing with. The growth in the number of people provokes the fear and then vengeance from the new Egyptian rulers, and the Pharaoh in particular, who didn't know anything about Joseph, doesn't know how indebted he actually is and how grateful he should be to Joseph and his descendants, and is instead terrified of all these Israelites hanging around the place, and decides that it's time to cull the numbers slightly. And so what happens is a brutal era of oppression and slavery sets in, and it's from that the people of Israel are then delivered in the great act of deliverance in a few chapters later, a dozen or so chapters later, the Exodus. The Exodus marks the beginning of Israel's journey to the promised land. And so if you're thinking about that promise in Genesis 12, what you're starting to see now is, first, God hanging on to the promise of people by protecting his people from death at the hands of the Egyptians. Second, you're seeing the beginning of the journey to the promised land, the land of Canaan, which of course had been promised to Abraham many years before. But you're also seeing something else. You're seeing how God is going to bless his people with his presence and with a relationship with them. And that highlights the overall structure of the book of Exodus. The first half, leading up to chapters 19 and 20, really is the story of the escape from Egypt and the preservation of the people. So you've got all the plagues. The plagues are best viewed as a contest between the Lord, Yahweh, the true and living God, and all the gods of Egypt, and it's a battle. Who's got the strongest God? And of course, you know the answer to that question, and you see that in the narrative as it unfolds. So that's the deliverance, all the narratives for which Exodus is so famous. Then in the middle of the book, you've got, of course, the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, chapters 19, and the Ten Commandments in chapter 20. And that really stands at the heart of the book and sets the stage for the second half, because here's the crucial fact about the law. The law is God showing his people how their relationship with him will be sustained in the years that lie ahead. It's important to understand what the law is not. The law is not the means by which the people of Israel get saved or redeemed from slavery. They're already redeemed from slavery when they're given the law. This puts the lie to the common misconception about the whole of the Old Testament, in fact. You've probably heard people say that, well, in the New Testament we're saved by grace and our obedience follows as a matter of gratitude or for some other reason, whereas in the Old Testament people were saved by keeping the law. That is about the most foolish misunderstanding of the narrative of Scripture that it's possible to imagine, because the people of Israel were already saved when God gave them the law. He redeemed them from slavery in Egypt before giving the law to them. The law then is God's way of living in relationship with him, a relationship that has already been established by grace. And in particular, as the law is expounded and then some details are given subsequently, not just in the Ten Commandments but in the second half of the book of Exodus, you find the instructions for the building of the tabernacle and then the actual building of the tabernacle in the second half of the book. And that really dominates the second half of the book. If you just count the chapters, it's a really big chunk of the book of Exodus is all about building this mobile sanctuary for the Lord, which then brings us to the climax of the book in chapter 40, when the Lord's presence moves into the tabernacle and the Lord is finally dwelling there with his people. So just think about those promises to Abraham again. You're expecting land, people, blessing. Well, Exodus finishes off the people aspect of the promise, preserves that against the tyranny and the threat of Egypt. It then begins the journey to the fulfillment of the land aspect of the promise, and really brings to something of a climax the blessing or relationship aspect of the promise. By the giving of the law, this is how to live in communion with God your Father, and of course by the instructions for and then the building of the tabernacle. So that's basically the shape of the narrative as a whole. Some things to look at in particular. Obviously, as you're reading it, you want to be paying careful attention to the Exodus and the Red Sea crossing. What am I talking about? Exodus and the Red Sea crossing. That's the paradigm of future deliverance, which again and again is in the background of prophetic imagery and imagery in the Gospels and elsewhere. Obviously, you've got the Ten Commandments, which you want to look at fairly closely. And also, it's worth paying attention to how the Ten Commandments are expounded in the 3 chapters that follow, Exodus 21 to 23. They're often neglected, which is a shame, because there's some really intriguing exposition of the law in those chapters, which has all kinds of implications for ethics and for how we think about law and so on nowadays. You want to look at the golden calf incident in Exodus 32. This is the paradigmatic second commandment violation. It's worth thinking about the first 2 commandments for a second. The first commandment forbids worshipping any other god than the Lord. The second commandment says you shall not make for yourself a graven image or any image of anything in heaven on earth or heaven and earth or the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them and worship them. And the point there is not that you're not allowed to make pictures of anything, but that you're not allowed to make pictures or images of anything for the purposes of worship. And it seems there that even for the purposes of worshipping the Lord is included. In fact, that's almost certainly the key point that's meant. The first commandment already prohibits worshipping some other god, so in order for the second commandment to be distinct from it, what it's actually saying, and this is what pretty much every commentator and theologian you'll read on the subject will say, is it's forbidding the worship of the true God using unauthorized means or images. And so when you get to Exodus 32, what you've got is the building of the golden calf, and Aaron says, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, and they held a festival to the Lord. Now he knows very well that the God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt is the Lord, and the festival to the Lord indicates that the God whom they're actually worshipping through this idol isn't some other God, it's the Lord himself. There's a second commandment violation you've got going on here, and therefore that has all kinds of practical implications for contemporary worship and also for worship in some religious traditions, some Christian traditions like Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. So it's a lot to think about there. You also want to think about all the details of the tabernacle, and it's tempting just to skip over those and think, oh yeah, more building of a tent and a bronze basin and this, that and the other. But the imagery and the typology there is quite significant in all kinds of ways later on, especially in books like Revelation and Ezekiel and so on. And finally, when you get to the climax of the book in chapter 40, you want to notice the problem that is highlighted as well. You've got the great good news climax of God moving into the tabernacle, being present with his people. But then you've got the problem highlighted that Moses and the elders can't go in because the Lord is present there. And so the big question at the end of the book of Exodus is, how on earth are we going to get in here? Because the Lord is present in there and we can't enter in. And that question is then answered, surprise, surprise, in the very next book of the Bible, the book of Leviticus. But we'll have to wait till next time for that. Okay, the Lord bless you, and hope to see you very soon. Bye for now.